Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into something that feels familiar, and yet, the more you look at it, the stranger it becomes. Time. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable, and when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a quiet joy to imagine all of us, scattered across the planet, each resting in our own little moment. Now you can dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket a little closer, and let your thoughts begin to slow, because tonight we're not rushing anywhere. We're simply going to sit with a question. What is time, really? You experience time constantly without ever needing to think about it. It's there in the gentle rhythm of your breathing, in the slow rise and fall of your chest, in the ticking of a clock somewhere in the background, or perhaps the soft hum of a fan turning in the dark. Time feels steady, reliable, almost comforting. 1 second follows another, then another, and yet, if you pause for a moment, you might begin to notice something unusual. Time doesn't always feel the same. There are moments in your life when time seems to stretch, like a quiet afternoon that lingers longer than expected. And then there are moments that slip away almost instantly, like a conversation you didn't want to end, or a memory that fades before you can fully hold on to it. A single hour can feel very different, depending on how you spend it. Imagine waiting for something. Perhaps you're sitting alone, watching the minutes pass. Each second feels noticeable, almost heavy. You become aware of time in a very direct way, as if you can feel it moving. Now imagine something else. You're with someone you enjoy being around, or you're deeply focused on something you love, reading, drawing, listening, maybe even just thinking. And suddenly, time disappears. Not literally, of course. The clock is still moving, the world continues, but your experience of time becomes softer, lighter, almost invisible. And when you finally look up, you realize that hours have passed. So which version is real? The slow one or the fast one? If time were truly fixed, like a ruler laid across reality, then every moment should feel the same length. But it doesn't. And that's where our quiet curiosity begins to unfold. Because this simple observation, something you've probably felt many times, hints at something deeper. Time, as you experience it, is not just something out there in the universe. It's also something that happens within you. Your mind plays a role in shaping it. Your attention, your emotions, your awareness, they all gently influence how time feels as it passes. But here's where things begin to shift, just slightly. Even though your perception of time can change, you might still assume that time itself is steady, like a river flowing at a constant pace while you simply drift along its surface. That's the picture most of us grow up with. Time moves forward, always forward, from past to present to future. Simple, clean, predictable. But as we begin to explore a little further, something quietly unexpected begins to appear. Because when scientists started looking more closely at time, not through feeling, but through careful observation, they found that time is not quite as rigid as it seems. In fact, time can stretch, it can slow down, and under certain conditions, it can behave in ways that feel almost impossible. But we won't rush into that just yet. For now, it's enough to stay with this gentle realization that time is not something you can hold. You can't see it directly, You can't touch it. You only ever notice it through change. A shadow moving across a wall, a cup of tea slowly cooling beside you, the quiet rhythm of your own heartbeat. Without change, time would feel like nothing at all. And perhaps that's why it feels so natural. Because it's woven into everything, every movement, every thought, every breath. It's always there, but never quite visible, like the air around you. And yet, just because something feels natural doesn't mean it's simple. Sometimes the most familiar things hide the deepest mysteries. Time might be one of those things. Because if you follow this idea just a little further, you begin to notice something even more subtle. You never actually experience the past. You remember it, and you never truly experience the future. You imagine it. The only thing you ever really touch is this moment, right now, and even this moment is difficult to define. By the time you notice it, it's already gone, slipping quietly into memory, replaced by another, and another, and another. It's like trying to hold on to water. No matter how gently you try, it keeps moving, and yet, somehow, from this constant flow, your mind creates a sense of continuity, a story, a feeling that time is moving forward, carrying you with it. But what if that feeling is not the full picture? What if time is not something that flows, but something that simply exists all at once, like a landscape rather than a river? And what you experience is not time moving, but yourself moving through it. It's a quiet idea, not something you need to solve or fully understand right now, just something to let rest gently in your mind. Because as we continue this journey, we'll begin to explore how this simple question, what is time, opens the door to something much larger, something that touches not only physics, but memory, perception, and even the possibility that time itself may be far more flexible than it first appears. And as that thought begins to settle, like mist over a quiet field, we can gently drift a little deeper into the story, not rushing, just following the thread, wherever it leads. As that quiet question about time continues to rest in your mind, something begins to shift, almost imperceptibly. Because up until now, we've been looking at time the way it feels. But what happens when we look at time the way the universe measures it? Not through emotion or memory, but through something much more precise. Clocks. Simple, steady, mechanical clocks. Imagine placing two perfectly identical clocks side by side. They tick in unison, each second matching the other exactly. There is no difference between them, no disagreement, just a quiet, shared rhythm. Now imagine something slightly unusual. You take one of those clocks and send it on a journey. Not a dramatic journey, just something simple. Perhaps it boards an airplane, circling high above the earth, moving faster than anything you normally experience in your daily life. The other clock stays behind, resting quietly, unmoving, here on the ground. When the travelling clock returns, you place them side by side again. At first glance, nothing seems different, but when scientists perform this experiment with extremely precise clocks, something remarkable appears. The clock that travelled is ever so slightly behind, not broken, not damaged, just a tiny fraction of a second slower. It's as if time itself moved differently for it. And this isn't a thought experiment. This has actually been measured, carefully, repeatedly, confirmed again and again. Time does not pass at exactly the same rate everywhere, and the faster something moves, the more noticeable this difference becomes. Now, the effect at airplane speeds is incredibly small, far too small for you to notice in everyday life. But the principle behind it is something much deeper, because it tells us that time is not fixed. It stretches, it bends, it responds to motion, to speed, and even more surprisingly, to gravity. Imagine now, not a fast-moving airplane, but something much larger, a planet, or even a star. The stronger the gravity around an object, the more it gently slows the passage of time nearby. Not in a dramatic way you would immediately feel, but in a quiet, measurable difference. If you had two clocks again, one placed high above the Earth and one resting closer to the surface, the one closer to the Earth, where gravity is slightly stronger, would tick just a little more slowly. It's a subtle effect, almost like time is being held just a bit more tightly. And once again, this isn't just theory, it's something we rely on every day without ever noticing, because far above you orbiting, quietly around the planet, are satellites. They carry clocks, extremely precise clocks, and these clocks are constantly communicating with your phone, helping it determine exactly where you are. This system, which allows you to find your location almost instantly, depends on time being measured with incredible accuracy. But here's the quiet detail most people never think about. Those clocks in orbit do not tick at the same rate as clocks on Earth. They experience less gravity, and they move very quickly, so their time drifts, just slightly, but enough that if scientists didn't correct for it, your phone's location would slowly become less accurate, by meters, then kilometers, all because time isn't perfectly synchronized. So every time you check a map or find your way somewhere new, you're relying on the idea that time itself behaves differently depending on where you are and how you move. It's a quiet reminder, hidden in plain sight, that time is not universal, not absolute, not the same for everyone. And this idea, once discovered, changed everything. Because for a long time, people believed that time flowed the same way, everywhere, like a single invisible current moving through the universe. But what we've begun to uncover is something much more delicate. Time is not separate from the world around it. It's woven into it, connected to space, to motion, to gravity. And this connection is what opens the door, just a little, to something even more unusual. Because if time can slow down, if it can stretch, if it can move differently depending on your path, then what exactly is it? Is it something that flows, or something that can be shaped? Imagine for a moment that you're not simply being carried forward by time, but that your path, your movement, your position, all influence how time unfolds around you. Like walking across uneven ground, each step feels slightly different. Some parts slower, some parts smoother. And now, something even more curious begins to appear. If two people experience time differently, if one clock runs slower than another, then in a very real sense, they are not sharing exactly the same timeline. They're close, very close, but not identical. And this is where the idea becomes quietly profound, because it suggests that time is not a single line that everything follows together. Instead, it may be more like a landscape, where each path, each motion, creates its own experience of time. And if that's true, then the question we began with, what is time, becomes something much richer. Not just a ticking clock, not just a flowing river, but something flexible, something responsive, something that can stretch and shift depending on how you move through the universe. And as this idea settles gently in your mind, you might begin to feel that familiar sense of time, just slightly, differently, not as something fixed, but as something alive, quietly adapting and moment by moment all around you. And from here, if we follow this thread just a little further, we begin to see that space itself, the very structure of the universe, is not separate from time at all. They are part of the same story, woven together, waiting to be understood, one quiet step at a time. As this idea of time slowly becoming more flexible begins to settle, something else quietly comes into view, because if time can stretch and slow and shift depending on where you are, then it may not be something separate from the universe at all. It may be part of it, woven into it, almost like threads in a fabric. To explore this, it helps to imagine something very simple, not equations, not symbols, just a soft, familiar image. Picture a large open sheet of fabric. It stretches out in all directions, smooth and quiet, like a calm surface waiting to be touched. Now imagine placing something on it, something with weight, a heavy ball perhaps. As soon as it rests on the fabric, the surface changes. It dips, gently at first, then more noticeably, creating a soft curve around the object. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet bending. Now imagine something smaller, a marble. You place it on the fabric, not too far from the heavier object, and instead of staying still, the marble begins to move, not because something is pulling it directly, but because the surface beneath it is no longer flat. It curves, and the marble simply follows that curve. It rolls, not toward the object itself, but along the shape that the object has created. This simple image, as soft and familiar as it feels, captures something very close to how the universe behaves. Because what we experience as gravity is not just a force pulling things together, it is the shape of space itself, gently curving, and time is part of that shape, not separate, not independent, but woven into the same structure. So instead of thinking about space and time as two different things, it can help to think of them as one, a single fabric, a quiet, invisible structure that holds everything, every planet, every star, every moment, all resting within it. This idea was introduced by a physicist whose work changed how we understand the universe, Albert Einstein. But instead of focusing on the mathematics behind it, we can stay with the feeling of the idea itself, because what matters here is not the complexity, it's the shift in perspective, the realization that space is not empty and time is not just ticking. They're both part of something deeper, a structure that can bend, stretch, curve, and even connect distant places. Because once you imagine space and time as a fabric, something interesting begins to emerge. If the fabric can bend, then perhaps it can also fold, and if it can fold, then two distant points might not be so distant after all. Imagine again that sheet of fabric. But this time, instead of leaving it flat, you gently lift it. You bring two far apart points closer together, not by moving across the surface, but by changing the shape of the surface itself. And suddenly, a journey that would have taken a very long time becomes much shorter, almost immediate. This idea, soft as it sounds, is the beginning of something we'll explore more deeply soon. The idea that space and time might allow for shortcuts. But before we go there, there's something even more subtle to notice, because if space can curve and time is part of that same fabric, then time itself follows those curves, just like the marble, which means that time does not flow the same way everywhere. It moves along the shape of the universe, gently guided by its structure. In places where the fabric is stretched, time flows differently. In places where the fabric dips, time slows, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, almost like a soft resistance. And this brings us back to something we touched on earlier, gravity. What we feel as gravity, that gentle pull that keeps your body resting against the surface beneath you, is not just a force, it's a sign that the fabric of space and time is curved around the Earth. You're not being pulled down, you're simply following the shape of the world beneath you. And your time, the rhythm of your heartbeat, the pace of your thoughts, is moving along that same curve. It's a strange idea, but also a comforting one, because it suggests that everything is connected. Your body, the ground beneath you, the motion of planets, the passage of time, all part of the same quiet structure, moving together. And if you let this idea rest gently in your mind, you might begin to feel that sense of stillness, just a little more deeply. Because instead of imagining yourself moving through a rigid, ticking timeline, you can begin to imagine yourself resting within a vast, curved landscape where time is not pushing you forward, but simply unfolding as part of the space you already inhabit. And from this perspective, something even more intriguing begins to take shape. Because if space and time can bend, if they can curve and stretch and shift, then it becomes possible to imagine that under the right conditions, they might do something even more unusual. They might connect, not just nearby places, but places that are incredibly far apart. Perhaps even moments that are separated in time. It's a quiet possibility, not something we need to rush toward, just something to notice as it begins to appear. Because as we follow this idea a little further, the fabric of reality itself starts to reveal something unexpected, something that feels less like a straight path and more like a folded map, where the distance between 2 points depends not on how far they are, but on how the space between them is shaped. And in that gentle shift, we begin to approach one of the most fascinating ideas in all of physics, the possibility that the universe may already contain pathways hidden within its own structure. Pathways that don't just move through space, but through time as well. As this image of space and time as a soft curved fabric begins to settle, something quietly invites us to take one more step. Because once you accept that the universe can bend, it becomes natural to wonder, can it do more than just bend? Can it fold? Let's return just for a moment to that simple sheet of fabric. It stretches out before you, smooth and calm, with gentle curves where objects rest upon it. You've already seen how a heavy object can create a dip, and how smaller things move along that curve. But now, imagine lifting that fabric slightly, not tearing it, not breaking it, just gently bringing two distant parts closer together. Points that once seemed far apart now sit side by side, and if you could move between them, you wouldn't need to travel across the entire surface. You could simply step across that fold, a shortcut, not by moving faster, but by changing the path itself. This idea, as simple as it feels, is one of the most fascinating possibilities in modern physics. It suggests that distance might not always mean what we think it means, because when space itself can be shaped, distance becomes flexible. Two places that seem impossibly far apart could, under the right conditions, be brought close together, not in the way we normally imagine, but in a deeper, structural sense. And this brings us to a quiet but powerful concept, a kind of pathway hidden within the fabric of the universe, often described as a tunnel, not a tunnel made of walls or light, but a tunnel made of space itself, a connection between two separate regions, created not by building something new, but by reshaping what is already there. If you were to imagine it, you might picture two distant points connected by a curved passage, like the inside of a hollow shape, where stepping in one side brings you out somewhere entirely different, far away, or perhaps far ahead in time. This idea is sometimes called a wormhole, but instead of focusing on the name, it's more helpful to stay with the feeling of it. A bridge, a shortcut, a quiet possibility that space is not as simple as it appears. Now, if this sounds almost too convenient, too elegant, that's because it comes with challenges, very real ones. Because bending space gently, as we described before, is something that happens naturally around planets and stars. But folding space, creating a stable shortcut, that's something entirely different. It would require an immense amount of energy, not just a lot, but something far beyond anything humanity has ever produced. To give you a sense of scale, imagine taking an entire planet, not a small one, but something as massive as Jupiter, and somehow converting all of its mass into pure energy. Even that might only begin to approach what would be needed. It's difficult to picture, so instead of numbers, it's easier to say this. Opening such a pathway would require more energy than anything we currently know how to generate, and even then, there is another challenge, something even more unusual, because to keep this kind of tunnel open, you would need a very strange kind of material, not something you can find in nature, not something we have ever held in our hands, a type of matter that behaves in the opposite way to everything we're familiar with. Instead of adding weight, it would, in a sense, resist it. Instead of pulling inward, it would push outward, holding the tunnel open, preventing it from collapsing. You might think of it as a kind of invisible support, gently keeping the structure from closing in on itself. Scientists sometimes describe this as negative behavior, but rather than focusing on the terminology, it's enough to imagine something that doesn't follow the usual rules, something rare, perhaps even not yet discovered. And this is where the idea becomes both exciting and uncertain, because while the mathematics suggests that such pathways could exist, we have never observed one directly, not yet. But there is a quiet possibility, one that begins far earlier than you might expect, at the very beginning of the universe, in those first moments when everything was dense, hot and rapidly expanding. Space itself was not smooth. It was turbulent, unstable, full of tiny fluctuations, stretching and shifting in unpredictable ways. And in that early chaos, some scientists have suggested that small distortions may have formed, tiny folds, minute connections, so small they might have been no larger than the tiniest particles imaginable, almost like microscopic wrinkles in the fabric of space. And as the universe expanded, as space itself stretched outward, those tiny structures may have stretched as well, growing larger, becoming more significant. It's a quiet idea that the universe, in its earliest moments, may have created pathways long before anything like stars or planets existed. Pathways that have simply remained hidden ever since. We don't know if this is true, but the possibility lingers, softly, because if even one such connection exists, somewhere, then the structure of reality may be far more interconnected than we realize, and if these pathways exist, even rarely. Then another question begins to form, not urgent, not demanding, just present. If such doorways are possible, who or what might be able to use them? Not necessarily us, not yet, but perhaps something else, something more advanced, or something further along in time. It's a thought that doesn't need an answer right away, just something to notice as it quietly settles into place. Because as we continue to follow this thread, the idea of travel begins to shift, not just across space, but across time itself and the universe, which once felt vast and distant, begins to feel just a little more connected. As this quiet idea of hidden pathways in the universe begins to take shape, it's natural for the mind to wander a little further. Because if such doorways could exist, if space itself can be folded, then a simple question follows. Why haven't we used them? Why haven't we opened one? Why don't we see them all around us? And as we sit with that question, the answer begins to appear not as a mystery, but as a quiet reminder of scale. Because the universe, while elegant, does not give up its deeper structures easily. Let's return once more to that image of fabric, soft, flexible, capable of bending and folding. But now, imagine trying to fold something much larger, not a sheet you can hold in your hands, but something vast, something that stretches across unimaginable distances. Because when we speak about folding space, we're not talking about something small, we're talking about reshaping the structure of reality itself. And that comes with a cost, a very high one. To understand this more gently, it helps to think in terms of effort. Imagine trying to lift something. A small object, like a book, is easy. A heavier object, like a chair, takes more effort. And something much larger, something like a car, requires far more strength than a single person could ever provide. Now imagine something even beyond that, trying to move, not an object, but the space around it, trying to reshape the invisible structure that holds everything in place. That kind of task doesn't just require strength, it requires energy, an extraordinary amount of it. So much that even the largest energy sources we know begin to feel small by comparison. Instead of thinking in exact numbers, it's easier to imagine it this way. If you could gather all the energy contained within an entire planet, not just its movement or its heat, but everything it contains, and somehow use it all at once, you might only begin to approach what's needed, and even then, it might not be enough. Because creating a stable shortcut through space is not just about opening it, it's about keeping it open. And that introduces another challenge, one that feels almost counterintuitive, because in the natural universe, everything tends to collapse inward. Gravity pulls things together, structures compress, openings close. So if you were to create a tunnel through space, something that connects two distant points, there would be a natural tendency for that tunnel to collapse, to close in on itself, almost instantly, like trying to hold open a passage made of soft material without any support. So the question becomes, what could possibly keep such a structure open? And this is where the idea turns, just slightly, into unfamiliar territory, because scientists have suggested that it might require a very unusual kind of substance, not something we interact with every day, not something we can easily observe, but something that behaves differently. Instead of following the usual rules, where matter pulls inward, this substance would do the opposite. It would push outward, gently resisting the natural tendency of space to collapse, holding the tunnel open, just enough for it to remain stable. It's a strange idea, almost like imagining something that falls upward instead of down, and because it behaves so differently, it has never been observed directly, at least not in any confirmed way. It remains a possibility, a theoretical requirement, something that must exist, if these pathways are to remain open, but not something we have yet found. And so, we find ourselves in an interesting position. On one hand, The structure of the universe seems to allow for these shortcuts. The mathematics suggests that they could exist. The fabric of space and time appears flexible enough to permit them. But on the other hand, the practical challenges are immense. The energy required is beyond anything we can produce. The materials needed may not even be available to us, and even if they were, we would still need to understand how to shape space itself, not just observe it, not just move within it, but actively reshape it. It's a quiet reminder of how early we still are in our understanding, because for most of human history, we didn't even know that time could slow down. We didn't know that space could bend, and now we're considering the possibility that it might be folded. It's a gradual unfolding of knowledge, step by step, layer by layer, and while we may not yet have the ability to create such pathways, there is another possibility, one that feels almost like a whisper from the past. What if we don't need to create them? What if they already exist, not as something built by us, but as something formed naturally, long ago, in the earliest moments of the universe? Because if space and time were once far more turbulent, far more compressed, then perhaps, under those extreme conditions, small connections could have formed, tiny passages, barely noticeable, like faint threads, woven into the fabric from the very beginning. And as the universe expanded, those threads may have stretched, grown, changed, perhaps becoming larger, more stable, over time. It's not something we've confirmed, but it's an idea that continues to be explored, quietly, carefully. Because if even one such structure exists, somewhere in the vastness of the universe, then the possibility remains, not just for movement across space, but for something more subtle, movement across time. And as this thought begins to settle, we arrive gently at another question, one that doesn't demand an answer, but invites reflection. If these doorways exist, if they're hidden within the structure of reality itself, then who or what might be capable of finding them? And more importantly, who might already be using them? It's a question we'll approach slowly, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet exploration. Because sometimes the most interesting ideas are not the ones we prove, but the ones we allow ourselves to consider. As the idea of hidden pathways begins to linger, not as something we can build, but as something that might already exist, our attention drifts further back, not forward into the future, but backward into the very beginning. Because if these doorways through space and time are too difficult for us to create, then perhaps they were never meant to be created at all. Perhaps they were formed naturally, in a time when the universe itself was very different from what we see today. To explore this idea, we need to imagine a moment so distant and yet so fundamental that everything we know began there, the beginning of the universe, not as a quiet event, but as something far more intense. Imagine everything, all matter, all energy, compressed into an incredibly small space, not just crowded, but almost indistinguishable. A state where the usual rules, the ones we rely on now, had not yet settled into place. There were no stars, no planets, no calm structure, only a rapidly expanding, shifting, almost turbulent environment. You might think of it not as an explosion in space, but as the expansion of space itself, stretching outward in all directions at an unimaginable pace. And within that expansion, the fabric of space and time was not smooth. It was unstable, fluctuating, almost like the surface of water during a storm, rising, falling, folding in on itself, forming patterns that would later settle into the structure of the cosmos. And in that early chaos, something interesting may have happened, because when a fabric is stretched and compressed at the same time, small irregularities can form, tiny folds, minute connections, barely noticeable at first, but present, persistent, like wrinkles that appear when something is pulled too tightly, and then released. Now imagine those tiny folds, not just as surface features, but as connections, points where space itself briefly touched or overlapped in unusual ways, and in those moments, very small pathways may have formed. Not large tunnels, not stable structures, but tiny connections, linking one region of space to another, almost like microscopic bridges woven into the fabric itself. At that scale, they would have been incredibly small, perhaps no larger than the tiniest units of space we can imagine. So small that even if they existed, they would be nearly impossible to detect. But here's where the idea becomes quietly fascinating, because the universe did not remain small. It expanded, and as it expanded, everything within it stretched. Distances grew, structures evolved, and if these tiny connections were part of the fabric itself, then they too would have stretched, growing along with the universe. What once may have been unimaginably small could, over time, become something larger, not necessarily large enough to step through, but perhaps large enough to influence the structure of space, to leave subtle traces, quiet distortions, patterns that hint at something deeper beneath the surface. It's a gentle idea, one that doesn't claim certainty, but it offers a different perspective. Instead of asking how we might build a doorway through space, it invites us to consider whether the universe, in its earliest moments, may have already created them, naturally, without intention, simply as a result of its own unfolding. And if that's the case, then these pathways would not be inventions. They would be discoveries, hidden features of reality, waiting to be found. And this shifts the question just slightly, because instead of asking, how do we create a wormhole, we begin to ask, where might one already exist? And perhaps even more intriguingly, how would we recognize it if we found one? Because if these structures are subtle, if they are woven into the fabric itself, then they may not appear as obvious openings, not glowing portals, not dramatic tunnels, but something far more delicate, a slight distortion, a place where space behaves just a little differently, where distances don't quite match expectations, where time might feel slightly altered. It's a quiet thought, but one that begins to connect with something we've already touched on, because earlier we spoke about how time can slow down, how it can stretch, depending on motion and gravity. Now imagine encountering a place where those effects are not just small, but more noticeable, where the structure of space itself is different, where time doesn't flow in quite the same way, not dramatically, but enough to feel unusual. And suddenly, the idea of these hidden pathways doesn't feel entirely disconnected from experience. It begins to overlap, gently, with certain observations, certain stories, moments where people have described a sense that something wasn't quite right, that time behaved differently, that space felt distorted. We won't draw conclusions, not yet, but it's worth noticing how these ideas begin to align, because science, at its quietest, often doesn't tell us what to believe. It simply shows us what might be possible, and in doing so, it leaves space for curiosity, for reflection, for the gentle exploration of ideas that sit at the edge of understanding. So as we rest with this image of a young universe full of motion and possibility, quietly forming tiny connections that may still exist today, we arrive at another soft question. If these pathways were created at the beginning of everything, and if they have stretched and evolved along with the universe, then perhaps they are not rare. Perhaps they are simply difficult to notice. And if that's true, then the universe may be far more connected than it first appears, not just across vast distances, but across time itself. And as this thought begins to settle, like a distant echo, our attention gently turns towards something more immediate, not the structure of the universe, but the experiences that might hint at its deeper nature. Moments where everything feels slightly out of place, slightly out of time, and from there, a new layer of the story begins to unfold. As the idea of hidden pathways begins to settle, not as something we build, but something that may already exist, a new question quietly emerges, not about the structure of the universe, but about those who might understand it more deeply than we do. Because if space can fold, if time can stretch, if there are pathways that connect distant places or even distant moments, then the possibility of travel changes. Not just travel across space, but travel across time. And when that thought appears, it naturally brings another with it. If such travel is possible, who would be capable of it? It's easy at first to imagine something unfamiliar, something entirely separate from us, beings from distant stars, civilizations far beyond our own. But there is another possibility, one that feels quieter and perhaps more unsettling. What if the travellers are not strangers at all? What if they are us, not as we are now, but as we might become, far into the future? To explore this idea gently, it helps to think about how much can change over time, not just years or centuries, but thousands of years, tens of thousands. Imagine looking back at humanity, not as it is today, but as it was long ago. Early humans lived very differently. Their tools were simple, their understanding of the world limited, and yet, over time, slowly, steadily, everything changed. Language evolved, technology advanced, knowledge accumulated, the world transformed. Now imagine that process continuing, not for a few hundred years, but for thousands, or even tens of thousands of years into the future. It's difficult to picture in detail, but one thing becomes clear. The beings that exist at that point may not resemble us in the way we expect, not because they are something else, but because they are a continuation of what we are, shaped by time, by environment, by choices, and circumstances we cannot yet predict. Perhaps their bodies adapt to new conditions. Perhaps their minds develop in ways we don't yet understand. Perhaps they rely less on physical interaction and more on information, communication, energy. And over such long stretches of time, even small changes can become significant. It's a quiet kind of transformation, not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual, like the slow shaping of a landscape over time. And now, imagine that such a future civilization discovers something we are only beginning to understand: the structure of space and time, the pathways hidden within it, the ability to move, not just across distance, but across moments. If they could do that, if they could navigate those pathways, then from their perspective, travelling to what we call the past would not feel impossible. It would feel like moving through a landscape they understand. And if they chose to visit earlier points in time, they might appear to us as something unfamiliar. Not because they are alien, but because they are different from what we expect, more advanced, more refined, perhaps quieter, more deliberate. It's an idea that doesn't claim certainty, but it offers a different way of looking at something we often describe as mysterious. Because throughout history, there have been moments, stories, observations of things that don't quite fit into our current understanding. Lights in the sky, objects that move in unusual ways, encounters that feel just slightly beyond explanation. And while many of these can be understood through natural causes, there are some that remain uncertain, unresolved, quietly open to interpretation. And instead of immediately assigning them to something completely unknown, it becomes interesting to ask, what if they are not visitors from far away, but visitors from another time, from a future that has not yet unfolded for us, but already exists in the structure of reality? It's a subtle shift in perspective. Instead of looking outward, we begin to look forward, and in doing so, the idea becomes less about distance and more about development, less about other worlds and more about what this world might become. And this leads to another gentle realization. Because if future humans exist, and if they have the ability to move through time, then their motivations may not be random. They might not be here to explore in the way we imagine explorers. They might be here for a reason, a purpose, something connected, not just to curiosity, but to necessity. Perhaps to observe, perhaps to understand, or perhaps to influence, not in a dramatic way, but in small, careful ways, subtle adjustments, quiet interventions, the kind that don't disrupt the flow of events, but gently guide it. It's a delicate idea, one that sits at the edge of science and imagination, but it connects naturally with everything we've explored so far. Because once time becomes flexible, once the structure of reality allows for movement between moments, then the past and the future are no longer completely separate. They become connected, different regions of the same landscape, and moving between them becomes a question of understanding the terrain. So as this possibility begins to settle, not as a conclusion, but as an open question, we find ourselves standing in a slightly different place, looking at the same sky, but with a different sense of what it might contain, not just distant star, but perhaps distant versions of ourselves. And from here, something else begins to emerge, because if such travellers exist, if they move quietly through time, then perhaps there have been moments when they were seen, not clearly, not completely understood, but noticed, briefly, in ways that left behind just enough detail to make us wonder. And as we gently follow that thought, the story begins to shift from possibility to experience. As the idea of travellers begins to settle, not as something distant, but as something that could be connected to us, it naturally leads to a quieter, more grounded question. If such travellers existed, if they moved carefully, quietly, through the structure of time, would we notice? Not clearly, not in a way that leaves no doubt, but perhaps in brief moments, subtle ones, moments where something feels just slightly out of place. And this is where our attention gently turns, not toward theory, but toward experience. Because throughout history, across different places, cultures and times, there have been accounts of things seen in the sky that don't behave the way we expect. Not always dramatic, not always loud, often quite the opposite, quiet, still, almost watchful. Imagine standing outside at night. The world around you is calm, the air is cool, there are no sudden movements, no strong winds, just a soft stillness. You look up, and for a moment, everything feels ordinary, stars scattered across the sky, faint points of light, distant and unmoving. But then, something shifts, a light appears, not quite like the others. It doesn't flicker like a star. It doesn't follow the steady path of an aircraft. It simply holds its position. Then, slowly, it begins to move, not in a straight line, not with any visible force behind it. It glides, smoothly, almost effortlessly, and then, just as quietly as it appeared, it changes direction, abruptly, without slowing, without turning in the way we expect physical objects to turn. It simply moves differently. And then, it's gone. No sound, no trace, just a lingering feeling that something was there, something that didn't quite follow the rules you're familiar with. Experiences like this have been described in many ways. Lights in the sky, objects that hover, then move suddenly, shapes that appear briefly as then disappear. And while many of these observations can be explained, weather phenomena, reflections, human-made technology, there are some that remain uncertain, not because they are impossible to explain, but because the available information is incomplete. And what's interesting is not just what is seen, but how it is experienced. Because in many of these accounts, people don't describe fear, not at first. They describe stillness, a kind of quiet attention, as if the moment itself becomes more focused, more contained, almost like the world has paused, just slightly. Sound seems softer, movement feels slower, even the air is sometimes described as feeling different, not in a way that can be measured easily, but in a way that is noticed, a subtle shift, as if the environment itself is responding to something unseen. And this is where things begin to connect, very gently, with what we've already explored. Because earlier, we spoke about how time can change, how it can slow down, depending on motion and gravity, how the structure of space itself influences the flow of time. Now imagine encountering a place or a moment where the structure of space is slightly different, not dramatically altered, but just enough that the usual patterns begin to soften. Time might feel slower, movements might appear smoother, transitions less abrupt, almost like watching something unfold in a slightly stretched frame, not frozen, not stopped, just subtly shifted. It's not something that can be easily confirmed, but it's an interesting overlap between experience and possibility. Because when people describe unusual sightings, they often focus on what they saw, but sometimes what they felt is just as important. A quiet sense that the moment itself was different, that something about time or space wasn't quite the same. And instead of rushing to explain it, it can be helpful to simply notice it, to let the description exist without forcing it into a conclusion. Because not every observation needs an answer immediately. Some are simply pieces of a larger picture, and when you gather enough of those pieces, a pattern begins to emerge, not clearly defined, not fully understood, but present. And that pattern suggests something simple, yet profound, that the sky, the space above us, may not always behave in the ways we expect, not constantly, not predictably, but occasionally, quietly, just enough to be noticed. And if that's true, then these moments, these brief observations, may not be isolated. They may be connected, not necessarily by a single explanation, but by a shared quality, a sense that something moved differently, that something existed within a slightly altered frame of reality. And as this idea begins to settle, not as proof, but as possibility, we find ourselves gently approaching something even more specific, because in some cases, these experiences are not just about seeing something unusual. but about feeling time itself behave differently. Moments where a few seconds seem longer than they should, or where an event feels disconnected from the usual flow. And from here, the story becomes a little more focused, a little more detailed, not just about lights in the sky, but about the subtle ways time itself might begin to shift. As these quiet moments of unusual movement in the sky begin to settle, not as something to explain too quickly, but as something to gently observe, our attention shifts just slightly inward, because sometimes what feels different is not only what we see, but how we experience time itself. You've likely felt this before in much simpler ways. A moment stretches, another passes too quickly. Time feels elastic, even in ordinary life. But now, imagine something a little more subtle, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet shift. You're standing still. Nothing around you has obviously changed, and yet something feels different. The air feels heavier, perhaps, or simply more noticeable. Sounds seem slightly muted, as if they're coming from a little farther away. Movements, your own, or those around you, feel just a bit slower, not frozen, not delayed, just softened, as if the moment itself has been gently stretched. It's not something you can measure with a clock, not something you can easily describe afterward, but in that instant, it feels real, clear, present. And what's interesting is that experiences like this have been reported, not frequently, but consistently enough to be noticed. In situations where something unusual is observed, people sometimes describe not only what they saw, but how time felt, a sense that events were unfolding differently, that the rhythm of the moment had changed, that everything had become slightly out of sync with expectation. Now, it's important to move gently here. Because human perception is complex, our senses are influenced by attention, by emotion, by context, and many of these experiences can be explained through natural processes, the way the brain processes information, the way focus sharpens certain details while softening others, the way anticipation or surprise can alter our sense of duration. But even with those explanations, there remains something interesting, because the feeling itself, the sensation of time shifting, is not entirely unfamiliar, and in a quiet way, it echoes something we've already explored, the idea that time is not perfectly uniform, that it can stretch and slow depending on conditions. Earlier we spoke about how motion and gravity influence time, how clocks moving at different speeds or resting in different places can measure time differently. Now imagine, not a clock, but your own experience, your awareness. If time can shift, physically, even by small amounts, then it's not unreasonable to wonder whether there are situations where those shifts become noticeable, not through instruments, but through perception. It's a delicate idea, one that sits carefully between physics and experience, but it invites a simple question. What would it feel like if time slowed down, even slightly, around you? Perhaps it wouldn't feel dramatic. Perhaps it wouldn't be obvious. It might feel exactly like these quiet descriptions, a soft stretching, a subtle slowing, a moment that feels longer than expected. And if that's the case, then experiences where time feels unusual may not be entirely separate from the structure of the universe. They may be small, local reflections of something much larger. Now, this doesn't mean that every unusual feeling is a physical change. Far from it. Most of the time, our perception explains these experiences well, but it does suggest something important. that the boundary between perception and reality is not always as sharp as we imagine, because your experience of time is always a combination of both. What is happening externally, and how your mind interprets it, and when those two layers shift, even slightly, the result can feel unusual, almost as if you've stepped just a little outside the normal flow. And this brings us back, gently, to the observations we touched on earlier, moments where people describe not just seeing something different, but feeling that the moment itself was altered. That time seemed to behave differently. Now, we don't need to decide what these experiences mean. Not yet. Because the goal here is not to prove, but to explore, to notice how different ideas begin to connect. Because we have a universe where time is flexible, a structure of space that can bend and possibly fold, and experiences where time feels just a little different. Individually, each of these is interesting, but together they begin to form a pattern, a quiet suggestion. That time may not always flow in the smooth, consistent way we expect. That under certain conditions, it may shift, subtly, gently, almost unnoticed, unless you're paying attention. And from here, something begins to change in how we approach the story. Because up until now, we've been speaking in general terms, ideas, possibilities, but there are moments, specific ones, where people have described experiences that bring these ideas into sharper focus, not as theories, but as events, moments that were witnessed, remembered, and later carefully described. And as we begin to move toward those moments, we do so slowly, not to prove anything, but to listen, to observe, to see what details emerge when we look a little closer. Because sometimes it's not the grand ideas, but the quiet, specific moments that reveal the most. Time equals, quote, 3 seconds, quote, / greater than. As these subtle shifts in time begin to feel a little more familiar, not as something dramatic, but as something quietly possible. Our attention now moves toward a particular moment, a specific place, a memory that has been told and retold, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certain quiet persistence. It takes us to a forest, not an unusual forest, just a stretch of trees, still and dark, somewhere in the English countryside. It is late at night, the air is cool, there is a softness to the silence, the kind that settles between the trees when everything else has gone still. And at first, nothing feels out of place. But then, something appears, not suddenly, not with a flash or a sound, just a light. At a distance, faint at first, almost easy to ignore, but steady, and different from the usual lights one might expect. It does not flicker like a distant star, doesn't move like an aircraft passing overhead. It simply remains, and then, slowly, it begins to shift. Not in a straight line, not with any visible pattern, but with a kind of smoothness that feels almost intentional. Observers at the time described it as unusual, not because it was loud or overwhelming, but because it didn't behave in the ways they were used to. And so, they moved closer, not rushing, not panicking, just curious, as you might be if something unfamiliar appeared in a quiet place. And as they approached, something else became noticeable. Not just the light, but the atmosphere, the air itself, felt different. Not in a way that could be easily measured, but in a way that was felt, as if there was a faint charge, a subtle tension present in the environment, the kind of feeling you might notice just before a storm, but softer, more contained, and at the same time, there was a sense that movement itself had changed, not stopped, not frozen, but slightly slowed, as if the moment was unfolding at a gentler pace. Again, nothing extreme, just enough to be noticed, just enough to feel unusual. And then, beyond the trees, the shape became visible, not clearly defined at first, but gradually. As the light shifted, something more structured began to appear, a form, angular, low to the ground, dark against the faint glow around it. Observers later described it as triangular, though even that description felt like an attempt to fit something unfamiliar into a familiar shape. Because what stood out most was not its exact form, but its presence, still, silent, and unlike anything they expected to find in that place. As one of them moved closer, something even more subtle occurred, a sense of connection, not spoken, not heard, but experienced, as if the moment itself had become more focused, more contained, and in that stillness, there was a brief interaction, a touch, a contact between the observer and the surface of the object. And what followed was not a sound or a movement, but something more difficult to describe, a kind of impression, as if information was being received, not through the usual senses, but directly. It did not arrive as words or images, but as something structured, something that could later be written down, sequences, patterns, simple yet precise, later described as a series of ones and zeros, a form of binary. But in the moment, it was simply an experience, one that left an impression, strong enough to be remembered, and after that, the object was gone, not with a dramatic departure, not with a sudden burst of movement, but quietly, almost as if it had never been there, leaving behind only the memory and the lingering sense that something had occurred, something difficult to fully explain. Now, as we sit with this story, it's important to remain gentle, because there are many ways to interpret such an event: natural explanations, misinterpretations, limitations of perception. All of these are possible, and they should be considered. But what makes this moment interesting is not the conclusion, it's the pattern. Because within this single account, we find several elements that echo what we've been exploring: a light that moves in unfamiliar ways, an atmosphere that feels subtly different, a sense that time itself may be slightly altered, and an interaction involving information rather than force, individually. Each of these could be explained, but together they form something more complex, not a proof, not a certainty, but a pattern, one that invites us to look a little closer, not with urgency, but with curiosity. Because if moments like this are more than isolated experiences, if they are connected in some quiet way, then they may offer hints, not answers, but hints, about how the structure of reality behaves under certain conditions. And as this idea begins to settle, we find ourselves drawn gently towards something even more specific. Because in this particular case, the patterns that were experienced, the sequences that were later written down, were not random. They were structured, meaningful, and when they were examined more closely, they appeared to contain something unexpected, something that suggested not just a message, but a point of origin, a reference, not to a place, but to a time. And from there, the story becomes even more intriguing, not louder, not more dramatic, just deeper. As the memory of that quiet forest lingers, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something softly unresolved, our attention turns toward one particular detail, not the light, not the shape, not even the stillness of the moment, but the pattern. Because what remained after the encounter was not just a memory, it was something more structured, something that could be written down, sequences, ordered, precise, at first glance, simple, a series of ones and zeros, the most basic form of digital language, two symbols, on and off, presence and absence. It's a language we use every day, even if we rarely think about it. Every message sent, every image displayed, every sound you hear through a device, all of it can be broken down into these simple patterns, long sequences of ones and zeros arranged in ways that carry meaning. So when these sequences were recorded, they did not appear random. They followed a structure, a pattern that suggested intention. Now, it's important to move gently here, because patterns can sometimes emerge from unexpected places. The human mind is very good at finding meaning, even where none was intended. But in this case, the sequences were later examined more closely, carefully, translated, using the same principles we use to interpret digital information, and what emerged was not noise, it was a message. Not long, not complex, but clear enough to raise a question. The message, in its simplest interpretation, suggested me think about observation, about humanity, about continuity, and then something more specific, a reference point, not to a location, but to a time, a year, far beyond the present, not tomorrow, not a few centuries ahead, but thousands of years into the future. If spoken aloud, it would be described as the year 8100. And this is where the story becomes quietly intriguing, because a reference like that does not point outward. It does not suggest distance across space. It suggests distance across time, and that opens a different kind of possibility. Not visitors from somewhere else, but visitors from somewhere else in time. Now, this is not a conclusion, not something we can confirm, but it is a perspective, one that fits gently with the ideas we've been exploring. Because earlier, we spoke about how time is not fixed, how it can stretch, how it can move differently depending on conditions. We explored the possibility that space itself might contain pathways, connections hidden within its structure, and we considered, quietly, the idea that if such pathways exist, someone, somewhere, might learn how to use them. So when a message appears, one that references a point far ahead in time, it naturally invites a question. What if the origin is not another place, but another moment? What if the source of the message is not distant in space, but distant in time? It's a subtle shift, but an important one, because it changes how we interpret the idea of unknown. Instead of imagining something entirely separate from us, we begin to imagine something connected, a continuation, a future that has unfolded beyond our current understanding. And if such a future exists, then communication, even across time, may not be impossible. Not in the sense of sending messages backward in a simple way, but perhaps through more complex interactions, moments where information is transferred not through wires or signals, but through direct experience, a kind of imprint, a pattern that can later be interpreted. And this brings us back, gently, to the moment of contact, because what was described was not hearing a voice, not seeing written text, but experiencing something internally, a sense of receiving rather than observing. And while that may sound unusual, it connects, in a quiet way, to something we've already touched on. The idea that information does not always need a traditional path, that under certain conditions, it may be possible for patterns to be transferred in less familiar ways. This is not something we fully understand, but it is something we're beginning to explore in different areas of science. The nature of information, how it is stored, how it is transmitted, how it relates, not just to matter, but to the structure of reality itself. And so, instead of focusing on whether the message is true or where it came from, it can be more interesting as to simply notice what it suggests. That time may not be a barrier, that information may not be limited to the present, that the future may not be as separate from us as it feels. These are quiet ideas, not conclusions, but possibilities, and as they begin to settle like soft echoes in the background, they invite us to look at the story from a slightly different angle, because if information can appear in this way, if patterns can emerge from moments that feel out of place, then perhaps time itself is not a strict boundary, but something more permeable, something that allows, under certain conditions, for connections to form, not constantly, not predictably, but occasionally, just enough to be noticed. And from here, as we gently move forward, another account comes into focus, one that is different in detail, but similar in feeling, because in that moment, it wasn't just information that seemed to cross a boundary, it was time itself, a moment where what felt like a few minutes may have been something else entirely. As the idea of a message from another time begins to settle, not as something to prove, but as something to gently consider, we move toward another moment, another account, one that does not center on a message, but on time itself, a difference in time, not subtle, not barely measurable, but deeply personal, felt directly. Imagine a quiet landscape, open, dry, stretching out under a dark sky, far from cities, far from noise, a place where silence feels complete, almost tangible. In such a place, even the smallest change becomes noticeable, a distant light, a movement against the horizon, something that doesn't belong. And on one particular night, something like that was seen, 2 lights, descending slowly, not falling, not rushing, just moving downward with a kind of quiet control, soft but unmistakable. Those who were there did not react with panic, at least not immediately. They watched, carefully, trying to understand what they were seeing. And as the lights approached the ground, one of them moved closer, again, not with urgency, but with a kind of steady curiosity, step by step, approaching something unfamiliar, and then something changed, not with a sound, not with a visible force, but with a shift in awareness, a moment of disorientation, a break in continuity. The details that follow are not entirely clear, not because they were hidden, but because the experience itself seems to have interrupted the normal flow of memory. There is a gap, a pause, and then, suddenly, the person is back, standing again, present, aware, as if only a few moments had passed, but something feels different, subtle at first, but undeniable, because while the experience felt brief, something else suggested otherwise. Physical changes, signs that time had passed, more than expected, more than experienced. A simple detail, but a striking one. Facial hair, growth that would normally take several days, yet here it was, present, after what felt like only minutes. And then, another detail, a watch, a small device designed to measure time with quiet precision. It did not match the moment. It showed a point, several days ahead, as if it had continued moving forward while everything else paused, or perhaps as if the person had moved forward without realizing it. Now, as we sit with this account, it's important to remain gentle, because there are many ways to approach such a story. Questions about memory, about perception, about physical explanation, all of these are valid, and they deserve consideration. But what makes this moment interesting is not just the details, it's the pattern, because once again, we see something that echoes what we've been exploring, a disruption in time, not just in feeling, but in measurement, not just in perception, but in physical evidence, a difference between what was experienced and what appears to have occurred. And this brings us to a quiet question. What does it mean for time to pass differently? Because earlier, we spoke about how time can slow down, how motion and gravity can affect the rate at which time moves. But those effects are usually small, measured with instruments, not felt directly, not experienced as a gap. But here, we're looking at something different, a separation between experience and outcome, a moment where the internal sense of time and the external measurement of time do not align. And that invites us to consider something gently. What if time is not a single shared stream? What if it is possible, under certain conditions, for different paths to move through time differently, not metaphorically, but physically? Imagine two paths, starting at the same point, moving forward, but taking slightly different routes. One path is smooth, direct. The other curves, bends, takes a longer way. When they meet again, they are no longer synchronized. One has experienced more time, the other less. Now, this is not just imagination. It reflects something real in the structure of space-time, but usually the differences are tiny, barely noticeable, and yet, if those paths could be altered more dramatically, if the structure of space itself changed enough, then the difference in time could become larger, noticeable, significant, and perhaps even experienced in the way described here. Again, this is not a conclusion, but it is a connection, a way of linking experience to possibility, because if time is flexible, if it can stretch and bend, then under certain conditions, it may also separate, creating moments where what is felt and what has occurred are not the same. And as this idea begins to settle, we return to something simple, the feeling of a moment, how long it lasts, how it is remembered. Because in everyday life, time feels continuous, reliable, but these rare accounts suggest something quieter, that continuity may not always be perfect, that under certain conditions, time may not flow evenly, it may skip, pause, or unfold along a different path. And from here, as we gently step back, we begin to see a pattern forming, not from one story, but from several, moments where space behaves differently, moments where time feels altered, moments where information appears without a clear source, each one incomplete on its own, but together they begin to suggest something deeper, not a single explanation, but a possibility that the structure of reality is more flexible, more connected than it first appears. And as this possibility begins to take shape, our attention turns once more, not to isolated events, but to a larger idea, one that tries to bring these patterns together, a simple question that now feels just a little more grounded. What if those who appear in these moments are not strangers, but something far more familiar? As these moments begin to gather, not as proof, but as quiet patterns, a deeper question starts to take shape. Not about what was seen, but about who might be behind it. Because if time is flexible, if pathways exist, if moments can unfold differently depending on how they are experienced, then the idea of travel through time no longer feels entirely out of reach. And if such travel were possible, then someone, somewhere, might have already learned how to do it. And that brings us gently back to a thought we touched on earlier, a simple one, but one that changes everything. What if they are not from somewhere else, but from someone else, not from another world, but from another point in time, and more specifically, what if they're not something unfamiliar, but something deeply familiar, a continuation of us? To explore this idea, it helps to step back and look at time on a larger scale, not in hours or days, but in thousands of years. Because when we think about the future, we often imagine something close, a few decades ahead, maybe a century. But beyond that, the details begin to fade. It becomes harder to picture. And yet, change does not stop. It continues, quietly, gradually, relentlessly. If you were to travel back in time, just a few thousand years, you would meet people who are recognizably human. They would think, feel, communicate. But their world would be very different. Their tools, their knowledge, their understanding of reality, all shaped by a different point in time. Now imagine the same process, continuing forward, not for a few centuries, but for tens of thousands of years. It's not something we can visualize clearly, but we can begin to sense the direction. Technology would advance, understanding would deepen, limitations that feel absolute today might no longer apply. And over such long periods, even the human body may change, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, adapting to new environments, new conditions, perhaps even new ways of living. If a civilization were to move beyond the surface of the earth, to live in controlled environments, underground or in space, their bodies might adapt, their needs might change, their focus might shift from physical survival to information, energy, and understanding. Over time, they might become quieter, more efficient, less dependent on movement, and more connected through other means. It's a gentle transformation, not into something alien, but into something different. And if such a future exists, if humanity continues to evolve, not just biologically, but technologically, then it becomes possible to imagine a version of us that understands the universe in ways we're only beginning to glimpse, a version of us that has learned how to navigate the structure of space and time, not as a mystery, but as a landscape. And from that perspective, traveling to the past would not feel like breaking the rules. It would feel like moving through a system they understand. And if they could do that, then their presence in earlier times might not always be obvious. They might not arrive in dramatic ways. They might not announce themselves. Instead, they might appear briefly, quietly, observing, interacting, only when necessary. Because if you had the ability to move through time, you would understand something important, that even small changes can have lasting effects, so you would move carefully, gently, minimizing disruption. And this aligns, in a subtle way, with the kinds of observations we've explored, moments that are brief, encounters that are incomplete, experiences that leave an impression, but not a clear explanation. It's almost as if whatever is involved is not trying to be fully understood, only partially seen. Now, this idea is speculative. It does not claim certainty, but it offers a way to connect the patterns. Instead of seeing these moments as isolated mysteries, we begin to see them as possible interactions, not with something entirely unknown, but with something that shares our origin, our direction, our future. And this leads to another quiet thought, because if future humans exist, and if they have the ability to move through time, then their relationship with the past might be more complex than we imagine. They might not just observe, they might learn, they might study the origins of their own existence, or perhaps they might be trying to understand something that went wrong, something that required them to look back, to revisit earlier points in time, not to change everything, but to adjust small details, moments that matter. It's a delicate idea, one that doesn't need to be resolved, because its purpose is not to answer, but to expand the way we think, to open a space where possibility can exist. Because once you consider that time is not fixed, that the past and future may be connected, then the idea of interaction between them becomes a little less distant, a little more imaginable. And as this thought begins to settle, we find ourselves gently approaching another layer of the story. Because if such beings exist, if they have evolved, changed, adapted over long periods of time, then their world may not be the same as ours, not just in time, but in place. And perhaps they're not always where we expect them to be, not above us, but somewhere else entirely, closer than we think. As the idea of future humanity begins to take shape, not as something distant, but as something connected to us, the question gently shifts once more, not just who they might be, but where they might exist. Because when we imagine the future, we often look upward, towards space, toward distant planets, orbiting other stars. But there is another direction, one that is quieter and often overlooked, downward, beneath the surface, into the spaces we rarely see. It's easy to think of the Earth as something fully explored, mapped, understood, but in truth, most of what lies beneath the surface remains hidden. The deeper layers of the planet, vast, complex, largely inaccessible, not empty, but simply out of reach. And this opens a subtle possibility that if humanity were to face conditions that make the surface difficult, unstable climate, radiation, environmental shifts, then adaptation might not lead outward, but inward, into controlled environments, sheltered, protected, sustainable over long periods of time. We already do this, in small ways. Underground structures, protected facilities, spaces designed to maintain stability, regardless of what happens outside. Now imagine that idea, extended across generations, not temporary, but permanent. Entire communities living beneath the surface, developing independently over long stretches of time. In such an environment, the pressures that shape life would be different. Light would be controlled, temperature would be stable, space limited but efficient. Over time, these conditions could influence development, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. Just as life on the surface adapts to sunlight, weather, and open space, life below might adapt to enclosed environments. Lower light, different rhythms, different priorities. And over thousands of years, these changes could become noticeable, not necessarily extreme, but enough to create a distinction, a branch, not separate from humanity, but a continuation, shaped by different conditions. And this idea, quiet as it is, appears in many places, not as science, but as story, as memory, as tradition, across different cultures, There are accounts of beings who live beneath the ground, not as monsters, not as threats, but as hidden inhabitants, observers, keepers of knowledge, sometimes described as guiding or assisting humanity in subtle ways. In certain traditions, they're referred to as ant people, a name that reflects not appearance alone, but behaviour, living in structured communities, working together, existing below the surface, out of sight. Now, these stories are not scientific evidence. They are part of cultural memory, symbolic, interpreted in many ways. But what makes them interesting is not whether they are literally true, it's how they align, gently, with the possibilities we've been exploring. Because if humanity were to divide, not intentionally, but through adaptation, then different paths might emerge, different environments, different developments, different ways of existing, and over long periods of time, those differences might become significant, not alien, but unfamiliar. And if such a branch of humanity existed, living beneath the surface, developing quietly over generations, then their relationship with time might also change, because in a controlled environment where external cycles are less dominant, the experience of time could feel different, more flexible, less tied to the natural rhythms of day and night, more shaped by internal systems. And if such a civilization advanced far enough, developing technologies, understanding the structure of reality, then their perspective on time might become something entirely new, not something to measure, but something to navigate. And if that were the case, then their presence, in moments like the ones we've explored, might not be as distant as it seems. They might not arrive from far away. They might already be here, not visible, not interacting openly, but present, observing, occasionally intersecting with our experience in brief, subtle ways. Moments where something feels different. Moments where time, or space, behaves slightly outside expectation. Again, this is not a conclusion, but a possibility, one that connects several threads. The flexibility of time, the structure of space, the evolution of humanity, the stories that persist across cultures, each one incomplete on its own, but together forming a pattern, a quiet suggestion that reality may be more layered than it appears. And as this idea begins to settle, another thought emerges. Because if knowledge can be developed over long periods, if understanding can deepen across generations, then it's possible that some insights, some ideas, might not originate entirely within a single time. They might be discovered and rediscovered, shared, in ways that are not always obvious. And this brings us gently to a figure who seemed to access ideas in a way that felt ahead of his time, a person whose work still shapes the world we live in today, not through mystery alone, but through insight, through imagination, through a kind of thinking that felt almost received. And from here, the story shifts once more, from hidden worlds to a single mind, and the quiet question of where ideas truly come from. As the idea of knowledge moving quietly across time begins to settle, not as something dramatic, but as something subtle, we arrive at a different kind of story, not about a place, not about an event, but about a person, a single mind that seemed to stand just slightly ahead of its time, a man who did not simply observe the world, but imagined it in ways that felt almost received. His name was Nikola Tesla, and to understand why his story matters here, we don't need to focus on every invention or every detail of his work. Instead, we can begin with something much quieter, the way he thought. because Tesla often described his ideas not as something he built step by step, but as something he saw, fully formed, complete, as if the solution already existed and he simply needed to bring it into the world. He would imagine machines, not as sketches on paper, but as moving systems inside his mind. He could watch them operate, adjust them, refine them, all without physically constructing anything. And only when the design felt complete would he begin to build. It's a different way of thinking, less like assembling something piece by piece, and more like uncovering something that is already there, like discovering a pattern rather than inventing one. And this way of thinking led him to ideas that were far ahead of his time, not in a loud or dramatic way, but quietly, consistently. He explored the idea of the energy, not just as something that moves through wires, but as something that could move freely through space. He imagined a world where power could be transmitted without physical connections, not through cables, but through the Earth itself, as if the planet were part of a larger system, a conductor, a medium through which energy could travel. It's a concept that feels ambitious, even today. But for Tesla, it was not just an idea. It was something he worked toward, something he believed could be achieved with the right understanding. And what makes this particularly interesting is not just the idea itself, but how it seemed to come to him. Because Tesla often spoke about moments of sudden clarity, insights that appeared without a clear step-by-step process, as if the boundary between thinking and receiving was not always distinct. He once described feeling as though his mind was simply tuning in, picking up on patterns that already existed, not creating them, but recognizing them. It's a subtle difference, but an important one, because it suggests a different relationship between the mind and the world, not as something separate, but as something connected. Now, this doesn't mean that Tesla was accessing something supernatural. There are many ways to understand such experiences: deep focus, creative intuition, the ability of the brain to process complex patterns below the level of conscious awareness. All of these can explain how ideas seem to arrive, suddenly, fully formed. But even within those explanations, there remains something quietly remarkable: the feeling that ideas sometimes appear, not gradually, but all at once, and when that happens, it can feel less like invention and more like discovery. Now imagine, just for a moment, that this process is not entirely limited to the present, that under certain conditions, the mind might access patterns that are not only emerging now, but have existed, or will exist, across time. It's not a claim, just a possibility, one that connects gently with the ideas we've been exploring. Because if time is not a straight line, if the past, present, and future are part of a larger structure, then information itself may not be strictly confined to a single moment. It may exist within that structure, accessible, in ways we don't yet fully understand, and perhaps some individuals, at certain moments, come closer to that structure than others, not by intention, not by design, but simply through the way their minds work. And if that's the case, then Tesla's insights, his ability to imagine systems so vividly, may reflect something deeper. Not that he knew everything, but that he was particularly sensitive to patterns, to connections, to the underlying structure of how things fit together. And that sensitivity allowed him to see further, not into the distant future, but just far enough ahead to glimpse what was possible. And as we sit with this idea, We don't need to decide where those ideas came from, whether they were purely internal or connected in some subtle way to something beyond, because what matters is the effect, the result, technologies, concepts, systems that appeared earlier than expected, ideas that seemed to arrive before their time. And this brings us gently to another thought, because if ideas can appear in this way, if they can emerge suddenly, fully formed, then perhaps they don't arrive only once. Perhaps they return again and again in different forms at different times, becoming clearer, more refined with each appearance. And if that's true, then what we see today may not be entirely new, but part of a longer pattern, a gradual unfolding of understanding, one that stretches across time, quietly connecting past, present, and future. And from here, as this idea begins to settle, we move gently towards something even more specific, because Tesla was not the only one to describe unusual patterns. There were moments when he believed he was not just imagining ideas, but receiving something, signals, structured, repeating, difficult to explain, and in those moments, the boundary between thought and communication seemed to blur just slightly. As the image of a mind quietly receiving ideas begins to settle, not as something extraordinary, but as something deeply human, we move a little closer to a more specific moment, a moment that feels just slightly different. Because while many of Tesla's ideas came as sudden insights, there were times when he described something else, not just imagination, not just invention, but the sense that he was receiving something, signals, faint at first, barely noticeable, like a distant rhythm repeating itself in the background. He described them not as voices or clear messages, but as patterns, structured, regular, almost like a sequence, something that did not feel random, and what caught his attention was not their intensity, but their consistency, a repeating pulse, a pattern that suggested intention. Now, it's important to approach this gently, because in Tesla's time, the understanding of signals, of transmission, of interference was still developing. Radio waves, electrical patterns, atmospheric effects, all of these could produce unusual observations, and many of the signals he detected may have had natural explanations, phenomena that we now understand more clearly. But what makes this moment interesting is not the conclusion, it's the experience. Because Tesla described a feeling that the patterns he observed were not entirely random, that they carried a kind of structure, a rhythm that felt almost like communication, not in words, not in language, but in repetition, in sequence, in pattern. And this brings us back, gently, to something we've already touched on, the nature of information. Because information, at its core, is not about meaning. It's about pattern, arrangement, order, a sequence of elements that can be interpreted. And in many ways, the simplest form of information is repetition, a signal that stands out because it repeats in a way that randomness does not. So when Tesla observed these repeating patterns, what stood out to him was not what they said, but that they seemed to say something at all, that they had structure, and that structure suggested origin. Now, again, there are many ways to understand this: natural signals, interference, experimental conditions, all valid, all worth considering. But within that moment, there was also a thought, a possibility, quiet, not fully formed, but present, that perhaps the patterns were not just natural, that perhaps they originated from something beyond immediate surroundings. And while Tesla himself did not claim certainty, the idea remained, gently, in the background. And this idea, whether literal or symbolic, connects in an interesting way to something deeper, because it raises a question not about signals alone, but about the nature of the mind itself. What is the mind doing when it receives information? Where do ideas come from? How do patterns become thoughts? And in most cases, the answer is clear. The brain processes input, it organizes it, interprets it, creates meaning, but sometimes the process feels different. An idea appears suddenly, without a clear path. A pattern is recognized before it is fully understood. A connection forms before the steps are visible. And in those moments, it can feel less like thinking and more like receiving. Now, this doesn't mean that the source is external. Often, it is simply the mind working beneath awareness, quietly assembling pieces until they emerge as a complete idea. But it does highlight something important, that the boundary between internal and external is not always easy to define, because your experience of the world is always a combination of both, what you perceive and how your mind interprets it. And when patterns become clear, when signals repeat, when something stands out against the background, the mind naturally seeks meaning, connection, structure. And this is where the idea becomes gently expansive, because if information is pattern, and patterns can exist across different scales, then perhaps information itself is not limited to a single place or a single moment. It may exist within the structure of reality, accessible under certain conditions, not as messages waiting to be received, but as patterns waiting to be recognized. And if that's the case, then moments like the ones Tesla described may not be about communication in the traditional sense, but about alignment, a brief moment where perception and pattern come into sync, where something that usually goes unnoticed becomes visible, not because it changed, but because it was recognized. And this idea, quiet as it is, connects gently with everything we've explored so far. The flexibility of time, the structure of space, the possibility that reality is more interconnected than it appears. Because if time is not strictly linear, if past, present, and future are part of a larger structure, then patterns may not be confined to a single moment. They may repeat, reappear, emerge in different forms across time. And this brings us to a subtle but important thought, because if ideas can emerge more than once, if patterns can be recognized at different points in time, then what we call new may not always be entirely new. It may be a rediscovery, a refinement, a continuation, something that has appeared before in a different form and is now appearing again more clearly. And as this thought begins to settle, we find ourselves gently approaching the present, because in the world around us today, there are technologies, concepts, ideas that seem familiar, not in the sense that we remember them directly, but in the sense that they feel as though they have been approaching for a long time, as though they are part of a pattern, gradually unfolding. And from here, the story becomes a little more tangible, a little more immediate, because what once seemed like distant ideas now appear in forms we can see, not exactly as imagined, but close enough to make us wonder. As the idea of patterns returning across time begins to settle, not as something dramatic, but as something quietly repeating, our attention shifts once more, not backward, but into the present. Because if ideas can emerge, disappear, and reappear, then what we see around us today may not be entirely new. It may be part of a longer unfolding, a continuation, a quiet echo of something that has been building over time. Take a moment to look at the world around you, not in detail, just in feeling, the way energy moves, the way information flows, the way invisible systems connect everything together. You hold a device in your hand or rest beside one, and through it, you can communicate instantly across vast distances. No wires visible, no physical connection you can see, just signals moving through space, carrying voices, images, thoughts. It feels natural now, familiar, but not long ago, this would have seemed impossible. The idea that information could move freely without physical connection was once only imagined, and yet, here it is, quietly present in everyday life. Now, consider something else. Light, not just as illumination, but as something more focused, more directed, beams of light, carrying energy, precise, controlled, capable of transferring power or information from one place to another. Again, not as distant idea, but as something that exists, in forms we are beginning to use. And when you place these pieces together, wireless transmission, focused energy, global communication, you begin to notice something subtle, a resemblance, not exact, not identical, but familiar, echoes of ideas that were once imagined long before the technology existed to support them. And this is where the story becomes quietly interesting. Because when we look back at minds like Tesla's, we see similar patterns, ideas of energy moving without wires, of the Earth itself acting as part of a larger system, of information, travelling in ways that were not yet understood. At the time, these ideas felt ahead of their time, difficult to implement, incomplete. But now, pieces of those ideas are appearing again, not in the same form, but in refined versions, developed, tested, integrated into the world we live in. And this raises a gentle question. Are these ideas simply rediscovered, the natural result of progress, building step by step? Or is there something more subtle at play? Not something dramatic, but something quieter, a pattern that unfolds over time, where certain ideas appear before they can be fully realized, then fade, only to return later, when the conditions are right, more complete, more usable. It's not a claim, just a way of looking at things. Because if knowledge develops gradually, if each generation builds upon the last, then it's natural for ideas to reappear, to evolve, to become clearer over time. But when those ideas seem to arrive earlier than expected, when they feel just slightly ahead of what is possible, it invites a different kind of curiosity, not about where they came from, but about how they fit into the larger pattern. Because earlier, we considered the possibility that time is not a simple line, that past, present, and future may be part of a larger structure. And if that's true, then the flow of ideas may not be entirely one-directional. It may not move only from past to present, but circulates within that structure, emerging where they can be recognized, reappearing when they can be understood, not traveling in a direct sense, but unfolding in a way that connects different moments. And this perspective, while gentle, changes how we see progress. Instead of a straight path forward, it becomes something more organic, more layered, like a pattern, slowly revealing itself, one part at a time, and within that pattern, certain ideas act like markers, points where understanding deepens, where something becomes possible that wasn't before, moments where the future seems to touch the present, not through events, but through knowledge. And if we return to the question of whether time can connect different moments, then this becomes another kind of connection, not through travel, but through insight, through the quiet appearance of ideas that feel just slightly out of place, not wrong, just early. And perhaps that's what we're seeing now, not evidence of something extraordinary, but the natural unfolding of a deeper structure, one that allows ideas to emerge when they are ready, regardless of when they first appeared. And as this thought begins to settle, we find ourselves in a different kind of space, not focused on specific events or individual experiences, but on the larger picture, the structure of time itself, because everything we've explored, from the bending of space to the stretching of time to the patterns that appear across moments, points towards something simple yet profound, that time may not be what it feels like, not a steady flow, but something more like a landscape, a structure within which everything exists. And as we gently move toward that idea, the story begins to quiet, not ending, but softening, like a thought, slowly drifting towards stillness. And now, as all of these ideas begin to settle, not as separate pieces but as something gently connected, we arrive at a quieter place, not a conclusion, not an answer, but a perspective. Because throughout this journey, we have followed a simple question: what is time? At first, it seemed familiar, steady, reliable, something that moves forward, one moment after another. But as we moved gently deeper, that certainty began to soften. We noticed how time feels different, depending on how we experience it, how a single moment can stretch or slip away, depending on where our attention rests. Then we saw something more. That time is not just something we feel, but something the universe itself treats with flexibility. Clocks can disagree, moments can pass differently, depending on motion and gravity. Time is not the same everywhere, and from there, the picture widened. Space and time revealed themselves as part of a single structure, a quiet fabric that can bend and stretch and curve, a structure that holds everything, not just where things are, but when they are. And once that idea takes hold, something changes, because if space and time are part of the same fabric, then distance and duration are no longer separate. They become aspects of the same landscape, and in that landscape, paths can differ, journeys can unfold differently, depending on the route taken. And this is where the idea of connection begins to deepen. Because if the structure of reality allows for curvature, then perhaps it also allows for shortcuts, for pathways that connect distant points, not by crossing space, but by reshaping it. And from there, the possibility emerges. That movement might not be limited to place, but could extend to time, not as a fantasy, but as a quiet consequence of how the universe is built. We explored what that might mean, who might use such pathways, what it would feel like if time shifted, even slightly. Moments where experience and measurement do not fully align. Moments where something feels just a little out of place. We listen to accounts, not to prove them, but to notice their patterns, the stillness, the subtle changes, the sense that time, or space, had softened just slightly. and we considered the possibility that those moments might not be isolated, but connected in ways we do not yet fully understand. We followed that thread into the idea of future humanity, not as something separate, but as something continuous, a version of us shaped by time and change. And if such a future exists, then the boundary between past and future may not be as absolute as it feels. We stepped into the quiet world of hidden places where adaptation might lead inward rather than outward, where time might be experienced differently, and then we met a mind, a single individual who seemed to glimpse patterns before they were fully understood, not as proof of anything beyond, but as a reminder that ideas can appear in ways we don't always expect. That insight sometimes feels less like creation and more like recognition, and from there we saw how ideas return, how patterns reappear, how what once seemed impossible becomes gradually part of everyday life. And now, as we step back from all of this, we are left with something simple. Time may not be a river. It may not be something that flows, carrying us forward. Instead, it may be something that simply exists, a structure, a vast quiet landscape where every moment has its place, the past not gone, the future not yet arriving, but both existing within the same whole. And what you experience is not time moving, but yourself moving through it, like walking across a wide open field, each step revealing a new view, not because the landscape is changing, but because your position within it is. It's a gentle shift in perspective, one that doesn't require certainty, only openness. Because if time is a structure, then the idea of connection becomes natural. Moments may influence each other, not just forward, but across the landscape. Patterns may emerge, not from a single direction, but from the whole. And the question of whether something can move through time becomes less about breaking rules and more about understanding them. But even with all of this, it's important to return to something simple. You are here, in this moment, aware, present, and whatever the deeper structure of time may be, this moment is where your experience unfolds, quietly, gently, without needing to resolve every question. Because sometimes understanding is not about reaching an answer, but about becoming comfortable with the mystery, letting it rest without urgency, like a thought that drifts through the mind and settles without needing to stay. And so, as this journey comes to a close, you don't need to hold on to every idea. You don't need to decide what is true or what is not. You can simply allow the questions to remain, softly, because time, whatever it is still unfolding around you, in the rhythm of your breathing, in the quiet stillness of the night, in the gentle movement of thought as it begins to slow. And whether time is a river or a landscape or something else entirely, in this moment, there is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. Just rest and let the quiet carry you